piracy means an illegal acquisition of someone else's property, there is no evidence. So, if we're going to have a legally binding ABS regime, and that is the proposition in front of us, this presents some particular problems against the circumstances. First of all, it is an entirely disproportionate response to the problem. Under the legally binding regime, these are the sorts of things that would be proposed and are on the table in this draft, heavily bracketed text, which is currently sitting on the table in the ABS. Under the legally binding regime, every transaction of a genetic resource from one party to another would be regulated. Every transfer of a loaf of bread. The example I thought was a very good one, but when you look to see what it means, it actually will cover virtually every food product. Now, most of the discussion today has been on the pharmaceutical industry, because they are our hosts, but when you look at what a standard definition of a genetic resource is, it will cover every food product. Some say, well, just have an obligation of prior disclosure, a mere obligation. In countries with organised systems of law, that inevitably would require the introduction of a system of regulation to demonstrate compliance with that. All regulation carries a cost. There's no such thing as costless regulation. And to go back to my point about disproportionality, if there is no biopiracy, why would you put in place a system which will erect a process of regulation and all the costs that bears to address the problem that may not actually exist? There's a second issue. There is, in fact, already quite an extensive free exchange of genetic products. Some of it is formalised, some is not. The FAO genetic plant, Brendan, correct, what's the title? That's right. The FAO Treaty on Plant Genetic Resources is quite important. If you go to the CBD meetings, at almost every meeting, the representative from the FAO has stood up and said, we are very concerned that an obligation to require a regulation of a transfer of a genetic resource from one party to another would destroy the public good that's been created by the FAO Genetic Plant Resources Treaty, because what does that treaty do? It provides free right of access to all farmers of publicly held plant resources and genetic resources. It's an extremely important mechanism for helping farming in developing countries, and it is regarded by farm scientists as a critical factor in improving productivity in food production. So we have a proposal in the CBD in front of us which, according to the FAO, would diminish the capacity of countries to improve agricultural production. Now, I don't know if you've paid much attention to G8 meetings, but in the last year, it's suddenly been realised that the international community faces a major problem in producing enough food to meet demand in the future. And what's been revealed, something quite shocking in my view, is that over the last 20 years, the share of development assistance to assist agricultural production has shrunk horribly. If you look at the numbers, they're quite staggering. Agricultural productivity has actually not kept pace with the demand. So if we introduce a treaty which restricts one of the core features of agricultural productivity, which is free access to publicly held gene banks in food products, we are actually erecting something which will impede the ability of the international community to raise productivity in food. Every transaction of a genetic resource, every food product would have to be recorded. That's the proposal on the table in its most extreme form. As I say, that would include supply of seed varieties, which are now free from gene banks. In other words, we would be regulating a system of free exchange of important resources which currently exists. Agricultural research and development of drugs would be impaired. There's a third problem in all that, if you think about it. There'd be economic losses to the economy. Now, this issue has been overlooked because, as I said before, one of the grand ambitions of the legally binding regime is to create government control over the economic resource. Obviously, if you speak to the officials in those countries and those agencies, they'd say to you, well, there's going to be a benefit from the state because the state will gain the benefits. Well, the state agency, which levies the fees, administers the systems, might gain the benefits, but the economic losses to the economy would be larger because bioprospecting would stall, agricultural innovation and food production would slow, research would fall, and with all that, so would foreign investment. In other words, this onerous system of regulation is something that's not discovered as a major problem would have quite significant development constraints. Now, there is a better approach, and I think thinking about how to approach this is quite important. There is a commitment to create a new international regime for access and benefit sharing by late next year. The differences that exist over what's on the table now mean it would be unlikely, if not impossible, to settle an agreed text from that. I think the government's meeting in Copenhagen in 2 weeks' time would have a greater chance of success in getting an agreement on a climate change convention, and we know how small that is, compared to what's on the table for the ABS. So what could be done? First, we need a process to access and benefit sharing that would be facilitative, not punitive. An obvious and essential thing to do is for countries to accept the proposition of granting property rights to genetic resources, particularly to meet the objective of supporting traditional knowledge and the rights of traditional people to enjoy the benefits of traditional knowledge. The Bonn guidelines, which have been referred to, provide an excellent framework for establishment of national systems to improve access and benefit sharing of genetic resources. We certainly need to see the definitions clarified if we're going to go down the path of some sort of legally binding regime. At long last, the WIPO has now decided to pick that up as a major task, and very logically, from a standpoint, it would be inefficient, if not impractical, for one body in the multilateral system to try to strike an agreement when the experts in intellectual property have decided they're at last going to try to give some clarity to the definition of these key terms. Finally, what's I think essential, which has been talked about, is its importance to enhance the capacity in developing countries to establish effective ABS regimes. There's a very serious need for this, which has been referred to, and frankly, it seems to me that if we are going to get a new international agreement on access and benefit sharing for genetic resources by the end of 2010, only an approach like this is one that offers a result. Thank you.